and welcome to Thursdays with the Starr Center. My name's Casey Stewart. I'm the Assistant Director of Programs and Experiential Learning here at the Starr Center. And we have a really exciting event tonight about the early American women's lives. And this is actually the last of our Thursdays series. So thank you for joining us. And just a couple things I want to go over real quick. This is currently being recorded. And we are also streaming live on Facebook. Also, please remain muted so that we can hear our guests tonight. But we still want to hear from you, so feel free to use the chat or raise your hand. We're really hoping for you to join the conversation. And with that, I will turn things over to Starr Center Director Adam Goodhart.
Thanks so much, Casey, and thanks to all of you for joining this final event of our Thursdays series that we've had going this whole semester since February, which actually, speaking of American history, February already feels like several centuries ago, at least to me. This series was a little bit of an experiment for us. It was an experiment with technology, for one thing, and getting a bunch of historians together trying to use technology is always a little bit of a hazard, but overall, despite a glitch here and there, I'm pleased. I think we're all pleased with how things went. And it was also an experiment in community. So over the past 20 years of the Starr Center's existence, we built a wonderful sense of community in Chestertown, a community that many or all of you are part of when we're able to gather non-virtually. We come together for conversations, for presentations, by visiting scholars, by faculty, by students, by community members, by journalists and political leaders from all over the country here in Chestertown. So we were sort of experimenting on could we capture that in a virtual realm? Could we capture both that sense of excitement at all of these different important guests, but also the sense of community and family that happens at some of the best events that the Starr Center does in person. And I think overall, that's also been really a success. It's been exciting to see the names and faces of so many familiar Starr Center friends, old and new, former students, and alumni and families and former visiting fellows and faculty and people who are scattered far and wide and might not normally be able to attend a Starr Center event in person. And of course, it's also been a little bit poignant seeing names and faces of people who we've really wished that we could get together with in person, but weren't able to do that yet. And we're looking forward to the time soon when we will be able to do that. So this evening's program, today's program, is, I think, appropriately enough something that features two members of our Starr Center community, of our far-flung Starr Center community. As many of you know, the Starr Center invites visiting fellows to come to Chestertown every year to work on important projects related to important questions about American history, culture, politics, and identity, and projects that are going to speak to a broad public beyond just the academy. Those visiting fellows come to Chestertown, live in the Visiting Fellows Residence on Queen Street, also known as the Patrick Henry Fellows Residence, and they work on their project, they become part of the community, they sometimes teach at Washington College. This year, our Patrick Henry Visiting Fellow has in fact been visiting us just virtually, and you'll meet her in just a moment. And we also are joined by a visiting fellow from 2 years ago, Tara Bynum, who is also coming to us remotely. We were going to be joined by a third of our past Starr Center visiting fellows, Martha Saxton, who is a professor of history emerita at Amherst College, and whose book on George Washington's mother was recently a finalist for the George Washington Book Prize, a fact of which we're very proud since she wrote at the Starr Center on her fellowship, right in the office below where I am now in the Custom House. Unfortunately, Martha had a personal situation come up that means that she was unable to join us in person tonight. She sends her regrets, and we're hoping to do an event with her either in person or remotely sometime soon. But I will introduce our two other guests this evening. So starting with the first person who was here at Washington College, we have Tara Bynum. and Tara is coming to us live from Baltimore, although she actually is a professor, an assistant professor of English and African American studies at the University of Iowa. Interestingly, she was hired there, what, about a year ago, Tara? And so far has visited Iowa only once.
Yep.
Because
I signed my contract the week before there was a global pandemic declared.
So you're a professor of history on a campus where you've spent about 24 hours. This weird world that we live in. Well, they are very fortunate to have you. And Tara was previously professor at Hampshire College, which she was when she came and joined us at the Starr Center in the summer of 2019. She was working on a monograph at the time, Reading Pleasures. It's now under contract with the University of Illinois Press and speeding towards becoming a real life book. And as she will tell us in a few minutes, it's about the ways that African American enslaved and/or free men and women felt good, felt positive emotions, found happiness and joy amidst their often challenged lives. In addition to her Starr Center fellowship, Tara has been the recipient of many other distinctions, such as fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Library Company of Philadelphia, and the American Antiquarian Society. So welcome, Tara. Our second guest is our current Patrick Henry History Fellow, Professor Judith Ridner. Judy is professor of American history at Mississippi State University. She is a historian of early America with particular interests in the American frontier, ethnicity, and immigration. And in, I think, sort of classic Starr Center fashion, she is actually somebody who doesn't just do early American history, but also branches out into oral history, into public history, into digital history, including an exciting digital project that focuses on the history of the civil rights movement through looking at the struggles in Starkville, Mississippi in the 1960s and 1970s. So very much simpatico with some of the work that the Starr Center is doing. And Dr. Ridner's current book project that she's been working on during her Starr Center fellowship year is Clothing the Babel. I'm sorry, did you say Babel or Babel, Judy? Clothing the Babel, Material Culture of Ethnic Identity in Early America, which uses visual and material culture to explore the construction of white ethnic identities in the early mid-Atlantic. So one reason we're excited to have this conversation happening is that Judy and Tara each come at this from not just different angles in terms of the disciplines that they work in, English for one and more traditional historical background for another, but also the kinds of sources that they use. And so I thought we would start by talking with them about the sources that they use. Oh, I'll also add that at a certain point in this evening's program, we will be joined by a special surprise guest commentator who will also speak to us about some work that person is doing on early American women's lives. So brace yourselves for the arrival and intervention of that surprise guest commentator. So Judy, I thought I would start with you. So you work on material culture and its relationship to ethnic identity, including to women's identities. So I thought maybe you could just tell us a little bit. Not everybody may be familiar with this term material culture and what it can tell us about people's lives, including women's lives. You're muted, Judy.
Whoops, sorry. Thanks so much for having me. I'm sorry that I couldn't be there in Chestertown this year, but thanks so much for inviting me for this conversation. I look forward to it. So material culture, it sort of is what it implies. It's the sort of material leavings of a society. So that includes all of the physical objects that we use and then leave behind in our daily lives. And it can also be, I should add, some of the representations of those material items. So in my own project, I've been looking at extant material culture. So things like clothing that has turned up in museum collections. But then I've also been using a lot of representations of material culture, like political cartoons, artwork, and things like that to get a sense of the way people looked in the 18th century. So at its most basic, material culture is the kinds of things we leave behind. And then as scholars, we use those things to sort of read back into the meanings people placed on these goods in their time and place, and how those material items reflect certain cultural values they had or certain cultural ideas that they held dear at the time. So it's a kind of, we use the material world then as a kind of window into the world of culture, the world of ideas in the past.
Great. And I think you were going to show us a few examples.
Sure. To give you some sense of how this plays in with women's lives. Let me show this slideshow from the start. Can everyone see my slides? Okay, great. So to talk about how material culture provides a real lens into women's lives, I'm going to show you a few things that I've looked at as part of this project. And most recently, I've been working on a chapter that focuses a lot on Quakers. And so I'm going to show you things that pertain a lot to Quakers as a kind of way to get into some of this. The first thing is a women's silk taffeta gown from about the time of the Revolution. It was probably worn by Anna or Rebecca Bartram. They were from, the Bartram family was a Quaker family. And so, and this is from, as I suggest, from the Winter Museum and Library. So this dress, first glance, it tells us a number of things about Quaker values. Many of us know that Quakers had committed themselves to a plain testimony, that what the clothes that they wore were supposed to be not ostentatious. They were not supposed to be displays of vanity. And this dress reflects some of that in that it's a plain color. It's a simple brown color. Does not include a lot of patterns. And so at first glance then, this looks very much plain clothing. Shows us the values of a Quaker woman. But when we look a little bit more closely at this, it's a silk taffeta gown. This is high-end fabric. So one of the other things that it shows us is that Quakers and Quaker women valued pretty fancy objects too. They might not have been fancy in the sense of being ostentatious or in bright colors or with a lot of lace trimmings, but this is high-end fabric that would have displayed their wealth and status in ways that other people could understand. The other thing we can see by looking inside the gown is sort of the course of a woman's life. And it's a little difficult to see from my photo, but you can sort of see the sweat stains under the arms in this dress. So this is a dress that's used. It shows someone's real life. And if we look more in greater detail at some of the stitching, particularly some of the stitching, I don't have some good photographs of some of this, but you can sort of see how the dress has been altered through time, probably to accommodate her pregnancies. So this is very much then a kind of living garment that shows us some of the course of a Quaker woman's ordinary life. So it's, that can give us this kind of window into women of the past who we might have very little information on. Likewise, when we go on, no, I don't want to. Okay, likewise, this slide, which is from the manuscript notes that a Philadelphian, John Fanning Watson, made for his published work, Annals of Philadelphia, that's published in 1829. In his manuscript notes, Fanning Watson includes all sorts of these fabric swatches, many of them from women's gowns. And this particular swatch is actually from a piece of fabric that a Quaker woman, Susanna Wright, who was the daughter of the man who founded Wright's Ferry, which is in Lancaster County on the Susquehanna River. She became a silk maker as an adult. She never married. She became a silk maker. And this is a swatch of the silk fabric that she produced. Well, I should say the silk that she produced, that she then sent to England to have woven into fabric. And so this is another little extant piece of material culture that gives us a little bit of insight into a Quaker woman's activities, into women's work, into the kinds of economic roles that women had in the 18th century. And then one other slide, another set of images this time, representations of material culture from the sketchbooks of John Louis Krimmel. Krimmel was a German immigrant artist who came over to Philadelphia about 1809. He dies quite suddenly and tragically in 1821. He's a quite well-known, he becomes a quite well-known genre painter, but his sketchbooks are really fascinating for some of the images that they contain of women and women's clothing. And one of the things I find really fascinating about the image on the right on my screen is how he juxtaposes an African-American woman wearing a reasonably stylish gown of the early 19th century, and then a Quaker woman dressed in what we now see as kind of stereotypically Quaker clothing of the early 19th century, with the scarf around her shoulders and the bonnet on her head. And then in the image on the left, he's done like little sketches of various hats, a lot of them Quaker hats, Quaker bonnets, a Quaker flat hat, shoes, and a few men's hats. So then artwork too is another way we get at the lives of women, at the way women appeared in the late 18th and early 19th century. And we can get some sense of the way other people were perceiving and reacting to women as they moved through the mid-Atlantic region. So these are just a few kind of things I thought I'd share with you just to give you some sense of the kind of insights material culture, either extant material culture or representations of material culture, can give us on ordinary women of the past, many of whom may be anonymous to us today.
Judy, thank you so much. And I'm looking forward, I'm sure we're all looking forward to hearing more from you in a minute about some of the stories that you've found through your work. But now I'll turn to Tara Bynum. And Tara, I wonder if you could tell us about the rather different, but also deeply illuminating sources that you use to learn about women's lives and thoughts in early America.
So, I think that the thing that I'm reminded after hearing Judy speak about this is kind of realizing that I'm forever dealing with material text as well, even though that's not necessarily my go-to thinking. So when I think about the women that I've been most interested in, I have been looking at letters. Letters are, kind of written on paper, a quill pen is used, ink is used, all of that is a part of the materiality of the text itself. I think there's also other kind of forms of text that I think are a bit more understood as literary. So if I think about poet Phyllis Wheatley, I'm reading her poems as well. But I think that the women that I am looking at are Black women, mostly enslaved, sometimes free. And I think where they show up, the way that their life ends up showing up isn't always in a traditionally literary form. So sure, poet Phyllis Wheatley has a book of poems. She also has a collection of letters that I can pull from and use. But I think that there are a lot of women that show up in list form. They're listed in the membership rolls of women's auxiliary organizations. They're listed in census information. They're listed in not necessarily afforded the same sorts of stuff, material culture in some respects, I guess I could say, that allows me to know their stories with any sort of completeness. But there's, I think, a very real sort of power in the list that I often find them in. And I think that there's something that emerges from the list form or the snippets and glimpses that I get in either printed text or also in manuscript. And, I think in our kind of conversation before we all gathered, together, I think that, I guess I was reminded of the woman that interests me most, and most recently, and it's Uber Tanner, who is Phyllis Wheatley's friend. So Phyllis Wheatley, you can go to Barnes & Noble or order her book off of Amazon with relative ease. Uber Tanner is far less known, and I've been able to build out a story about Uber Tanner. There's still, some details missing, but I've been able to build out a story about Uber Tanner that's tied to the letters that Phyllis Wheatley leaves behind, and also tied to the way that she shows up in endless form. And there's so much more that I can say about her, so I'll stop there. But I do think that the idea that on the one hand, Judy and I are looking at very different sorts of things, and yet I think that what Judy speaks to is kind of precisely the stuff that I'm using. And there's so much more to say about the actual, paper that Wheatley uses, the ink that Wheatley uses, the quill pen that Wheatley uses, and so many other folks, thinking about who binds her book, what the printing press is. I think all of those things are part of the materiality of lived experiences. So in the end, we all end up kind of needing to defer to material culture studies, because everything, I think, ultimately ends up being that kind of material. So I'm mostly looking at things that are put down on paper.
Tara, when you talk about the materiality of stories literally being on paper, I can't help but share something that I experienced in the past week as a powerful emotional as well as intellectual impact on me. So over the past couple of weeks, my colleagues Casey and Airlee and I have been working with a recently discovered collection of documents here on the Eastern Shore that includes a lot of rich and never before seen African-American history. And there's one particular document, it dates from probably the 1810s. It's actually a handwritten handbill, manuscript handbill advertising for the capture of a woman who had escaped from slavery. And it describes this woman, it says who her husband was, it says that she has escaped with her 15-month-old child. And just imagine trying to escape from slavery with a 15-month-old toddler in tow. She must have really, really wanted and needed to be free. And so as we were reading this document, which is somewhat tattered, which has been folded and unfolded, it says at one point in the document, a woman named, and then there's a fold and a flake in the paper, and her name is gone. And it just was sort of heartbreaking that here was this heroic, extraordinary woman from the past, and her name was lost to us because of this one little flake that fell out of the paper. And just that preciousness, as you say, Tara, the materiality and the ephemerality of memories and of history when they're committed to paper is, it just hit me very powerfully in that moment. And especially, as you say, when we're talking about African-American women's lives, for whom the traces of existence are often just slender threads. Sorry for sharing that story with you, but what you said struck me powerfully. Well, I wonder, Judy, Tara, were you coming in to say something?
No, I just was gonna, with my voice, be affirming, not just a head nod. I appreciate the story.
Thanks. Well, Judy, I wonder if you'd like to tell us about one woman whose life you've looked into, who you've found particularly of interest.
Sorry, I'm getting now you can hear me. Thank you. Actually, there are two women, but why don't I just talk about one of them? Again, I think it goes to this theme that I think Tara mentioned, excuse me, the theme of snippets. It's a woman by the name of Anne Irvine, who was married to someone I followed actually in my first book on Carlisle, Pennsylvania. She was married to William Irvine, who was a brigadier general during the American Revolution. And what's interesting about her is that she was the daughter of a quite prominent fur trader. So she came to the marriage with a fair amount of property. But tracing her life is fairly difficult. And her husband, William Irvine, was an immigrant who came over from Northern Ireland. They marry in Pennsylvania, raise whole lot of kids. But finding about her life really meant going through a lot of his documents. His letters to his son in particular sometimes contain little postscripts that Anne wrote to the son as well. And a lot of William's letters to his wife Anne detail their correspondence and their lives together, but there are basically no extant letters from Anne to William. So reconstructing her life and their relationship kind of depended upon reading through the lines of William's letters, reading between the lines of his will that he writes. He dies a couple of decades before she does. And so it's that kind of, essentially we engage in a certain amount of historical detective work to put together stories about women, even some women who were reasonably well-to-do, to sort of flesh out their lives. And I think it's a lot like what Tara was talking about with regards to Uber Tanner, that essentially you kind of have to reconstruct women by finding little snippets of information here and there. And ultimately, using those snippets and kind of pulling them together, we do get a reasonably complete picture of who these women are and kind of what they were about and what their lives were about. And I think that's inherently quite interesting. So she's, I think, a good example that comes to mind right off the top of my head.
Thanks, Judy. And Tara, what about you?
I'm gonna give the spotlight, like I said, to Uber Tanner. I think that she is one who I learned the most about by way of reading Phillis Wheatley's letters to her. I think there are about 9 of them or 10 of them between 1772 and 1779. So, you know, it's the height of the Revolutionary War era when they are writing to one another. And what's interesting about Uber Tanner is that we have Wheatley's letters to her because she saves them and gives them to, I think it's Catherine Eads Beecher, and Catherine Eads Beecher gets them to the Massachusetts Historical Society. So I think it's also interesting to imagine like Uber Tanner at 80 or 90 years old deciding to make sure that Wheatley's legacy is preserved. And in doing that, I can't speak to where Tanner's letters are to Wheatley, but we do get a glimpse of what's going on in Tanner's life by way of what Wheatley is saying to her. So, you know, I think that what can be inferred is like Uber Tanner lives in Newport, Rhode Island. At some point, she has to go live in Worcester because of the war and the various kind of British occupations of Newport. It's also clear that they share their Christian faith, and I would argue they kind of worship on the page together, on the lettered page together. There's also a point at which Wheatley has to leave Boston because of the British occupation there, and Wheatley ends up in Providence. And I think that there's even more of an exchange between Wheatley and Tanner then. And I think that what I've had to do to learn more about Tanner for sure, and also Wheatley as a result, is kind of to remember that historical context that they are a part of. And I will admit that that I am deeply literary and formalist in my interpretation, but I've had to become far more historical. So I will, you know, kind of finally acknowledge the historian's contribution to the field. I appreciate all of you. But that historical context and paying attention to that historical context and using newspapers, using the letters and journals of other folks to kind of add richness to that story has kind of helped me learn that much more about who Uber Tanner is and who she becomes after Wheatley dies in 1784. So on the one hand, Wheatley's story kind of ends rather abruptly. She's in her early 30s. Uber Tanner doesn't die until 1835, and she shows up again in the subscription list to Reverend Samuel Hopkins' very long book called The System of Doctrines, in early treatise of systematic theology. And she shows up again as the president of the Women's Auxiliary organization in Newport, Rhode Island. And I think it's with the help of these snippets that I'm able to kind of, glean bits and pieces of Uber Tanner's life. And she also has an obituary as well, and is footnoted in the Massachusetts Historical Society's proceeding. So I think that all of these texts in their various forms have come together to help me understand this relationship between these two women when Wheatley is alive, but also kind of remind me that Tanner keeps living, gets married, is a part of her community in a very kind of real and well-documented and still extant way.
And what have you learned that's new about Wheatley herself? Because, you know, so many of us have had sort of a brief introduction perhaps to Wheatley as his first significant African-American literary figure, and her maybe she didn't 5-minute BFF relationship with George Washington, right, in 1775 or 75, I think, 76.
Yeah, 75.
Yeah, so what, you know, we all have this sort of, or many of us have this sort of Cliff Notes knowledge of her, but what did you learn that goes sort of beyond what other scholars have gleaned about Wheatley?
You know, I think that there's a letter that was sold in 2005 to a private person as opposed to an institution, and I screenshotted it and have kept it, fortunately. So I have been able to, I guess, in my own way, have access to it. And it's February 14th, 1776. And in this letter, Phyllis Wheatley is walking down the street with Mr. Kwamina. They encounter Mr. Zingo, and it is Cato Coggeshall who has dropped off the letter. And this is a letter to Uber Tanner. I hadn't bothered with the letter for some time, but recently, as I've kind of gotten deeper into the book, but also been thinking about, you know, another project, an emerging sort of project, also about the same time period and more about Newport, Rhode Island, I was struck, I was compelled to return to that letter and to think about not only the date, February 14th, 1776, like we know what happens in July of 1776, right? So there's that to contend with. And also thinking about Mr. Kwamina, who's John Kwamina. John Kwamina is a Black man who wins his freedom with the help of the lottery. He plays lotto, hits big, buys his freedom. He was part of Samuel Hopkins, who was Reverend of the First Congregational Church, missionary work. So John Kwamina and another Black man, Bristol Yama, were sent to Princeton in order to kind of get educated so that they could do missionary work in West Africa. That doesn't end up working out well. Zingo Stevens, who's also in Wheatley's letter, is interesting too, because he works at a stonemason's shop and is enslaved to the stonemason there. And there's some debate about whether or not he engraves gravestones, and he may do that or he may not, but either way, he works in this stonemason's shop in Newport, Rhode Island. And Cato Coggeshall and Zingo Stevens in 1780, 4 years after this letter, will become founders of the Free African Union Society in Newport, Rhode Island. And Cato Coggeshall will also do the same sort of work in Providence. So in this letter, and I think this is the only extant letter that does this, Wheatley kind of builds out the Black community that she interacts with. And I think that what we know for sure are the various ways that the white community and white women's communities have been instrumental in Wheatley's kind of poetry success. You know, I think there's been a lot of work that kind of documents that, but this letter, I think, offers us a glimpse of Wheatley, not just in relation to Uber Tanner, but in relation to John Kwamina, Zingo Stevens, and Cato Coggeshall, and the Black community in Newport, Rhode Island, and also in Providence, Rhode Island. And what's also interesting about Newport is that its Black community has so much extant stuff. There's so much extant stuff. Zingo Stevens and Cato Coggeshall show up in the in the meeting minutes and notes of the proceedings of the Free African Union Society. Zingo Stevens, I don't know the title of the book, but he has a book that's at the Beinecke Library right now, and his name is kind of in the on the first pages of it, real big, Zingo Stevens. So I think it's interesting, and I guess what I have learned most recently and what has kind of captured all of my attention is the idea that Phyllis Wheatley on the 14th of February, 1776, is walking down the street in the evening with John Kwamina, and they bump into Zingo Stevens, and Cato Coxshall drops off the letter. And all of this is noteworthy to Uber Tanner, presumably because Uber Tanner also knows who these men are. And I think that this second project that's emerging is one that's really interested in thinking about the Black communities that Wheatley is a part of. And this one in particular, because it's one that Wheatley has actually named and included herself in this way. So I think the punchline is ultimately, we know Wheatley best as the kind of lone Black woman in the frontispiece. It was how this talk was advertised. I think that that's how we remember her. And yet what is become that much more apparent is that she's not alone, as the frontispiece would have us think, but she is surrounded by these various communities. And the Black community that surrounds her is one that I am increasingly interested in knowing more about, and also knowing how Wheatley relates to that community as well.
Tara, thank you. That's fascinating. And I feel like it has all kinds of echoes with how we think about and talk about figures, other iconic figures like Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman as well, whether isolated or part of communities. But I want to turn to our surprise mystery guest, who's not that big a mystery. It's my colleague, Casey Stewart, Assistant Director for Programs and Experiential Learning at the Starr Center. And all of us at the Starr Center are very proud and excited for Casey, because he is in literally like the last days of finishing his dissertation, his doctoral dissertation in English at the University of Delaware. And along with a lot of other exciting work that Casey has done, which we hope you'll hear more about on other occasions soon, he's done some work on an early American female literary figure who it actually also turns out has connections to Washington College. And this was before you even decided to work at Washington College, Casey. So I wonder if you could tell us for a moment or two about her.
Yeah, it was pretty amazing to find her name on the wall as soon as I walked into the custom house during my interview. So it was just incredible. So the woman who I work with is Elizabeth Graham Ferguson, and she was a member of the Philadelphia intellectual community of the late 18th century. And so a quick rundown of her story. She was the daughter of a medical doctor. Her mother died when she was young, and so she was raised by this doctor. And basically, her father objected to the man who she would end up marrying. And as she was preparing to tell her father that it was officially happening, he dropped dead. And so eventually what happens is her husband fathered a child with another woman, was a loyalist, fled with the British after when they left Philadelphia. And so that's a sort of messy, quick summary of her life. But what's really interesting to me about Elizabeth Graham Ferguson, and where I think she fits into this conversation, is that women are always present in early America. You know, it might not always be legible to us, but they're always present. And so this idea of having to piece together these different pieces of evidence to find where they are and what they're doing is so crucial. And in the case of Elizabeth Graham Ferguson, it's literally a matter of legibility. She is deeply invested and understands literature. She understands science. She was a close friend of Benjamin Rush. She was a close friend of William Smith, the founder of Washington College. But she didn't have the formal education, so she lacked the handwriting ability that many of her male counterparts had. So she actually wrote a whole translation of the epic poem Telemachus, brought it to a Philadelphia printer, and he said, "I can't read this. What do you want me to do with this? You've given me this massive volume of what looks to me like gibberish. I can't do it." So she did it a second time, and still no good. And so if you've ever looked at 18th century handwriting, it can be a little difficult to understand. Now couple that with the added difficulty of someone who doesn't know how to properly, quote unquote, properly form letters. It's an added challenge. So she's remained largely unworked with. There's been very little scholarship that has sought to transcribe her writing. My advisor as an undergrad, Rodney Mader, transcribed her poem, "The Deserted Wife," which tracks that whole story I was mentioning earlier. But for my purposes, I study early American science, and one of the poems that I'm really interested in is one that she wrote that's mourning the death of Dr. John Fothergill, who was an English scientist. And I really see that as a way that she's inserting herself into conversations about science. She herself was not able to become a doctor. She herself was not able to do scientific experiments or go out on expeditions, but she was able to do poetry. She was able to participate in the salons and copy poems from her book and into others and vice versa. So there's other ways that women are doing all kinds of things, and it's a matter of retraining ourselves, I think, to understand what that evidence points to.
Thanks, Casey. Well, I want to encourage other folks to start chiming in with comments or questions. Feel free to type comments or questions into the chat or raise your hand and we'll call on you. And while you're collecting your thoughts and questions, maybe Judy, I'll just turn briefly back to you. And Tara and Casey have just been talking about women who, well, if not certainly elite in the case of Wheatley, because she was a woman who had been enslaved. These were women who were participating very actively in the sort of highest levels of cultural life in their time and creating literary texts. I wonder if you could talk at all about some of the women in the other echelons of society and what kind of evidence of their lives were left behind. Women who may not have been literate, who, as opposed to Elizabeth Graham Ferguson, may not have had handwriting at all, good or bad.
Yeah. Well, I think then we kind of look again to snippets, sometimes to material culture. I think some of the things that I had in my opening slides suggest that, again, we can turn to extant clothing, because frequently clothing ends up in museums, not because it's associated with a famous person, but because a family decided that it was an important artifact to the family's history and to the family's life. And it's something that holds a certain amount of nostalgia to them. And then, 200 years later, suddenly that 18th century dress is it is an object of fascination to curators, especially when it belongs to an ordinary woman. And so it ends up in a museum collection because 200 years later, this dress is very rare. So we can look to things like that to get some sense of, women's bodily, the size, their height, their weight, their physical bodies, which are also a form of material culture. So material culture is one of the great sources for sort of women who remain mostly anonymous in history. But then, we also do, as historians, we also do work in lots of, social historians have been doing work for decades in public records, like wills, like court documents. One of the women I followed, again, this is in my first book, was the wife of a tavern keeper. And he has a ledger. She comes up in that ledger sometimes. And then when he dies, she ends up running the business for him. And we can trace her running the business through newspaper advertisements. We can see her coming into the local court to speak on behalf of her children and sort of administering the estate for their interests. And again, I have nothing where she's, I have no written document from her. Probably she was illiterate, but again, she's one of these mostly anonymous people who ends up appearing in public records frequently and in newspaper advertisements frequently. And so I can sort of piece together some real evidence of what her life was like in the late 18th century. So I think it kind of comes back to doing a lot of historical detective work, but also looking at objects to find things that may get at, that may be representative examples. We may not know where who owned a particular dress in many cases. Many of the dresses that are in museum collections, people don't know who owned them, especially when it comes to ordinary women's clothing. One of the examples I didn't show you, Winterthur has this a dress from the early 19th century that's very typical of an ordinary person's plain style. It's unknown who owned the dress. It's unknown which ethnic group owned the dress. But again, it suggests some things about how ordinary women were dressing in the early 19th century. So again, we can use those kind of objects to extrapolate some larger ideas about women's lives and women's daily experiences. So I go back to a combination of documents and material culture.
Well, if we walked through the streets of Philadelphia or Baltimore at the turn of the 19th century, could we expect to see women in lots of different ethnic garbs? I know you did show us that very striking image of the young woman of African descent and the young woman from a Quaker background, and although you can't really tell her race, probably white, but what would it be like to walk down the street in Philly in 1798 and look at how people were dressing?
Well, I think we would see differences. Now, some of the differences to our eyes today would look fairly subtle. They would look very subtle. Certainly, Quakers would stand out because particularly the hats that they wore. By 1800, women have adopted the kind of classic Quaker bonnet that we associate now with people like Susan B. Anthony. So that would be quite striking. But a lot of people would be dressed in ways that we as 21st century Americans would not necessarily be able to distinguish. But people from 1798 would absolutely be able to distinguish because, as I frequently tell students, people knew fabric like we know designer labels today. So today we look at a designer label and we've got, we sort of peg somebody. But in the 18th century, people looked at fabric, they looked at styling, they looked at tailoring in ways that told them who people were. That, again, a German person in 1798 might be wearing, again, a plainer sort of style than an English person in 1798. To us, they might look pretty much the same, but to people at the time, they did not. And hairstyles, things like hairstyles, they were different. They varied by ethnic group. Germans frequently had this German men, a sort of boxy haircut that, again, we wouldn't think very much of, but people at the time would notice. And these would all be, just as we read people's physical appearances today to make judgments about who they are and what they're about, people were doing the same thing at that time. It's just that the cues they were reading were different than the ones we read today.
And you said something else that fascinated me a moment ago. You talked about what we can learn about bodies from surviving clothing. I wonder if you can elaborate on that. What were 18th century bodies, women's bodies like?
Well, you can see, and again, it's somewhat difficult to say because frequently, as many of people on the Zoom may know, the clothing items that get saved are often representative of people who were unusually small, for instance, or unusually short. And thus their clothing could not get remade for other people, could not get easily remade for other people. So sometimes extant clothing can give us a somewhat misleading sense, because certainly if you look at many of the gowns that exist, women were tiny, absolutely tiny. Most of the gowns that exist are just tiny, short and very, very petite women. And that's, to a certain extent, that suggests, yes, there were indeed short and petite women in the 18th century. But that does not necessarily confirm a lot of popular stereotypes that I'm sure many of us have heard who work on the 18th century, but they were shorter back then. That's not necessarily confirmation of that. It does suggest, though, that items that got saved are things that, again, often represent things that were not easily, they couldn't be pulled apart and sewn back together again for somebody else who was larger or bigger. So I think historians are certainly talking about questions about what gets saved in archives, and I think material culture is very much part of that conversation. And this question of bodies kind of speaks to that. What got saved and what didn't get saved. And certainly a lot of unusually sized clothing was the stuff that got saved frequently.
Thank you, Judy. I'm really excited that we're joined tonight by several really very nationally distinguished historians of early American women's history, including Mary Beth Norton, who's chiming in with a comment, Cassandra Good, who I see on this Zoom as well. And so in addition to our already distinguished guests, we have these other folks who it's great to have joining us from other corners of the country. And so Mary Beth and Cassandra, if you would like to chime in as well, I would certainly invite you to do that. And Mary Beth mentions that there's a biography of Elizabeth Graham Ferguson that's out, and she's also a woman in a recent book on Loyalist women. And so Casey, you better get your work on Elizabeth Graham Ferguson published soon, because others are breathing at your heels.
I'm falling behind.
Well, let me just comment that I knew Anne Austerhout, who wrote the biography that was published in 2004. And I have also spent a lot of time deciphering the, shall we say, unpracticed handwriting of 18th century women, not just Elizabeth Graham Ferguson. So I appreciate very much what Casey was saying about how hard it is to read. She's actually better educated than most. I actually had a letter to the editor in the Women-Mary Quarterly some time ago about the kinds of handwriting that I was encountered when I was doing Liberty's Daughters. This was years after the book was published, when there was an article in the Quarterly about New England women learning to read and write. And I went back to my notes to look at the kinds of weird spellings and orthography that I had encountered when I was working on it. But one of the things I discovered was that many women, not Elizabeth Graham Ferguson, but many women in the 18th century wrote basically the words the way they sounded, so that you have to read them aloud to understand what they are, because the spelling is so unusual. And of course, we all know that Abigail Adams spent a lot of time apologizing and what a bad writer she was, because she had not been formally educated. It was something that a lot of 18th century women felt about themselves. There were lots of apologies in those letters that I read. But anyway, it's been a very interesting session.
Thanks, Mary Beth.
Sure.
Yeah, and I'm flattered to even be mentioned alongside Mary Beth Norton here, whose work has been so important to my own. So it's nice to see everybody here and hear about this new research. I wrote a little bit about Elizabeth Graham Ferguson in my first book because of her friendships with men. Her letters, Casey, I assume you've seen her letters with Benjamin Rush at the Library Company.
I have.
If you're interested in science, and she's really engaged with this. And in part of what's been useful for me about this conversation is my mind has been turning about teaching in the fall, and I teach a class on the colonial America and the American Revolution, where students write about individual people and how the revolution changed their lives. So I give them a list of people to choose from, and I try to avoid having very many white men on that list, and finding women where there's enough for an undergraduate to find sources about them, and especially non-white women, is incredibly tricky. So I've sort of been thinking about those questions as I'm hearing this. How do you get this information to your students too?
You know, something that you're saying that several of you are saying about women's handwriting reminds me again of something that we've discovered in these papers that Casey and Air Lee and I have looked at over the past week. So there are some letters to a kind of an ordinary house carpenter in Kent County, Maryland in the 1780s from members of his family, including a couple of letters from his mother, who's up in Massachusetts. And there's one letter from his mother, it's signed by his mother, Ruth Staples, and she writes in a very beautiful, flowing, accomplished 18th century kind of copperplate hand. And then there's a second letter from around the same time to this man, Alpheus Wheelock, from his mother, Ruth Staples. And it's written in incredibly laborious, kind of crabbed handwriting with a lot of phonetic spellings, and also signed Ruth Staples. And so it was a reminder to us that when we see a document that's signed by a figure in the past, handwritten and ostensibly signed by a person in the past, it doesn't necessarily mean that that person wrote a letter, or even that that person was necessarily literate, and that people did a lot of dictating of letters in the past, and that we don't even know if it was Ruth Staples who wrote the second letter. Perhaps she dictated a letter to somebody who was less literate than the person to whom she dictated the first letter. So I wonder, you know, Tara, you work with texts that might purport to be from one person, but actually be coming from another, or whose authenticity is sometimes challenged. And I wonder if that is particularly an issue with women's documents sometimes.
You know, I'm gonna say that I guess I have worked mostly with folks who've already been adequately vetted, you know? So thinking about Wheatley, like, somebody else has already done that work. At least that's my hope anyway. And I think that because Uber Tanner exists by way of Wheatley's letters, and I mean, she does have one letter that she writes when she's the president of the Women's Auxiliary arm of the Free African Union Society. But I think that also, as I understand it anyway, has already gone through a vetting process, or, you know, something to that effect. So I will say that that is kind of where my lit side shows up. You know, I leave it to the historians to figure out for me later if I'm wrong, or if somebody else was wrong and I'm, you know, reproducing an error or something in that way. I did want to kind of go, Cassandra, to your question about like, how do we teach this? So I have become increasingly obsessed with this friendship between Wheatley and Uber Tanner. One, because stuff is, you know, kind of relatively extant. And, you know, I posed this question to a group of students. When you think about the Revolutionary War, do you think about Black women? And they were all kind of like, no. It's like, well, you should, because they were in fact alive. They were present at different, you know, in many different ways during the era. And I think that as a late adopter to historical context, it took me a second to kind of think about Wheatley as a refugee from the siege of Boston in 1775. Like, she's in Providence because the British have occupied the town. The British have occupied the town because there is a war. And I was like, in the various things that I've encountered about Phyllis Wheatley, war refugee is never one of them. You know, she's a poet. She's the first Black poet to publish a volume of poetry. She's the first Black woman to do many things, you know. And so I guess I have kind of made it my, you know, my purpose in some respects with students to kind of get them to think about Black people as present in those historical events where we kind of leave them out somehow. You know, I also think too about my own scholarship and making sure that it does remember the fact that the letter that I've referenced is written months before the Declaration of Independence, months after Lord Dunmore's proclamation, you know, weeks after the Battle of Quebec. You know, I think that all of that matters in its own way, even as Wheatley is just kind of walking down the street on a wintry evening in Providence, Rhode Island. So I guess I would if you haven't already, I would encourage you to add Phyllis Wheatley to your list. I think there's enough goodies for the undergraduates to make use of. And I think it just does something, I guess, at least for my students, I think it did something to have them think like, oh, that makes sense that there would be Black women there. And then I have to be like, well, you know, the Boston Massacre was on the same street that Wheatley lived on. I don't know if she was home or not, but certainly can you imagine the ruckus? Like when you do get home, like, oh, there was a whole thing that happened. And that whole thing ultimately, you know, will lead to this other whole thing later. So yeah, I just had to, you know, and there are other people too. So, you know, and I could provide you with the primary source documents as well to add that context if we want to go in on this. Just email me later is what I'm trying to say, so that we can figure out how to add to this list. I think it's a great exercise.
Thanks, Tara. And I certainly didn't mean to suggest that women's letters or documents had problems with authenticity that men's don't, but rather that we don't always know whether a document is a solo or a group effort. We sometimes it's solo when it can be more than one. And as Cassandra points out, occasionally prominent men's letters were signed by them, but actually written in their wives' hands. So it cuts across gender lines. Well, we have some questions and comments coming in. So there's a question from Amanda Moniz about women's biographies that use material culture as one type of supporting source versus women's biographies driven by material culture. For instance, Marla Miller's book on Betsy Ross, and incidentally, Marla Miller wrote that book on Betsy Ross in part also right here in the Custom House as a Starr Center fellow. So Judy, would you like to comment on that at all, the way that material culture is used in different biographies?
Sure. I guess what I would always say, what I say is what I, you know, we're talking in part about teaching, is what I also say to students, which is it's always key to ask, is material culture an accessory to what you're doing, or is it driving the questions that you're asking about people and about places and about the historical context we're examining? So, you know, Marla Miller is very skilled in material culture. So she's somebody who's really kind of, you know, are you working from the ground up or from the person down? And it seems to me that that's kind of the critical issue. Like I think about Zara Ashanslan's book, Portrait of a Woman in Silk. And, you know, in many respects, that's maybe not certainly a biography of, I'm just blanking on her name. It's not a biography of the woman on the cover, but it certainly deals with her life, the context of the portrait that's painted of her that she features on the cover, and her questions come from material culture and sort of work out. So it seems to me that when you're dealing with material culture, is the material culture being used to generate the questions about the person, or are we examining a person's life using material culture? And I think those are two sort of different things.
Thanks so much, Judy. And we have a number of people chiming in with really interesting comments in the chat. None of them are questions per se that I can see, but I'll encourage people to read those comments as well. But if other folks don't have questions, if you do have questions, raise your hand or put it in the chat. But I thought I would sort of bring us to a close by asking each of you, where do you think sort of the next frontier or frontiers in women's history are? Each of you certainly is working on a frontier, but sort of where are the places in women's history and early American women's history specifically where you see great opportunities for the rising generation of Americanists?
I'll take a stab. And this is purely speculative. I think what we're seeing now is, and I think some of Tara's comments speak to this, is that what historians are doing now a lot is reminding people of all of these sort of, I'll call them background contexts happening during major events. So that, yeah, we talk about the American Revolution. And, you know, as she suggested earlier, Tara suggested earlier, we then have to remind our readers and our students that there's a lot more going on there than just what's happening with, politics and government, and that people are playing roles in these major events in ways that we haven't necessarily acknowledged before. So I think I come back to a somewhat Gary Nash-like position, I think, and sort of say, I think we're kind of rewriting a new narrative that is starting to place, and again, it's not wholly new, but we're writing another narrative that is starting to highlight other aspects of major stories that include women in very substantial ways, that they're not just the power behind the throne, that they are really shaping events, shaping ideas in ways that maybe we haven't acknowledged in the past. And that this is kind of a new version of the new social history of, say, the 70s and 80s. So.
Thank you, Judy.
I think to build off of that, I guess when thinking about Black women's history, there's so often an emphasis on what's not there. There's not enough information. There's not much to work with. There's not. And I think I guess I see the potential for a move towards understanding what is there, and to also then remember, as Judy suggested, that these women are a part of the story. They're not peripheral to the story. They're ever present in the story. And sometimes they leave behind things that we aren't necessarily looking for. So, I kind of go to this account book that I'm also obsessed with. My 18th century obsessions are rather lengthy. So there's an account book that I'm deeply obsessed with that was put together by an enslaved man named Caesar Linden. And Caesar Linden is also based in Newport, Rhode Island. And Black women show up in his ledger. And one, I don't necessarily think that the ledger is always kind of the go-to, certainly not on the lit side of the house. And yet there's a whole world that comes alive in Caesar Linden's ledger to include Black women's stories. So Sarah Searing and Bess Thurston go over to Bristol for reasons that aren't necessarily clear, but there's oh, okay. They took the ferry from Portsmouth to Bristol and, did their business there, whatever it might be. And there are other sorts of glimpses in Caesar Linden's ledger. And I guess every time I go to it, I'm reminded I need to be better at thinking about every kind of text as a possible entree into a Black woman's life, instead of trying to look for one particular form of a thing or, deciding that this isn't useful, but that thing is. And because I think that, I guess I'm still so struck and impressed by the various places that Black women show up. And so I guess I would say that I guess I see the next opportunity to be remembering that Black women are ever present in this history, in this kind of pre-1800 history. And yes, I, as the researcher, need to be that much more mindful about the assumptions that I'm bringing into the Special Collections Library or into the archive, and, not necessarily go to what I might think of as the most obvious, but maybe what feels less obvious to me or not as intuitive to me, because I wasn't born in the 18th century and didn't live then. So, I think that there has been certainly a retraining on my part, and I think others are beginning to use different sorts of text, different sorts of material culture in order to tell those stories better.
Thank you so much, Tara Bynum and Judy Ridner. We're so proud and excited to feel that we've given some small support to your important work. We're delighted to have you part of the far-flung Starr Center family, and thank you for being here with us this evening. Thanks to all of you who joined us, not just at this event, but at our other virtual Starr events this semester. And we would love to hear from you about how these events have gone. We're thinking about Are we going to continue with doing some events that are just virtual ones? Are we going to try to do a hybrid model where will there be some events that you can only enjoy if you're willing to come in person? This is stuff that we, like a lot of cultural institutions, are figuring out. So we'd love to have your candid assessments. What worked, what didn't work, what would you like to see more of or less of when our programs come back to you in the fall semester. Just on behalf of all of us at the Starr Center, my colleagues Pat, Casey, Air Lee, Carolyn, Amber, Jasmine, Colin, our hearts go out to all of you. We hope that you're keeping safe, that you're keeping happy, that you're embracing the incipient summertime, and that we'll see all of you in person very, very soon. So everyone have a great evening and have a great summer. My gosh, I can't believe it. It is the end of the school year, huh? Bye, everybody.
Thank you.